So for those that are joining us, I want to thank Kelly Lundquist for joining me. We're going to be talking about her memoir, Beard. And I have to say, Kelly, I reached out to you because I was researching a piece on lavender marriages and mixed orientation marriages, and your book was coming out, but I hadn't read it yet when I reached out. And then I suddenly got scared and I was like, oh, her publisher is like a Christian publisher. And what if
Yeah.
like I end up realizing like this is like a settling of scores, but it's not. Like the book is beautiful.
Mm.
So
Oh, thank
congratulations.
you. Thank you.
It it's really wow. Like I didn't know I was going to learn so much about literary theory. I mean, I'm also an English major, but I actually gave up on grad school, but I'm married to an academic. So I felt like you explained defamiliarization in a way that made more sense to me. And I still don't understand Derrida, but thank you for trying.
Neither do I. I remain a PhD dropout, so that was part of the part of the journey of
Well, I
of
wondered
that
if you were
stage of my
ABD
life.
then. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, still, yeah, I ended up, after I got divorced, I moved back in with my mom and dad for a while, kind of moved around. I taught English in Europe and did some other things. And, just I worked at a bank, filing in the basement of a bank for a while,
Oh,
which is pretty
wow.
depressing. And then I ended up going back and getting my MFA in creative writing instead of doing a PhD. And
Okay.
now that I teach, in the Minnesota state system, that's considered a terminal degree, so we get paid
Right.
at parity with PhD. So it's like it wouldn't really be a huge advantage to me to like finish it up for the amount of work and time it would take.
Well, so tell everybody who, many people probably are just discovering Beard, or hopefully they'll buy it after this and they'll be listening. It's also an audio. You narrate it. Um, but it took you 20 years basically to get this to the thing, which I have to say, I mean, I understand I'm still working on a memoir and a novel, and it's a long process, and it's really difficult to get a memoir published these days. So tell us a little bit about why you were ready, or
Mm.
sort of give us a little bit of the path, because a lot of our followers are writers and interested in this kind of process. Like why go back to something that was obviously a painful time in your life and revisit, excavate, and analyze this for others to then tell you what they think about you?
um, okay, so I mean, I think that time in my life was so definitive for me. Like, there's really not been another relationship in my life that was as formative as that one. And I mentioned this kind of towards the end of the book, but pretty much everything in my life that I'm proudest of since that time. So we split up in 2003, so it's been 22 years now. But everything that I'm proudest of in my life has kind of originated from that relationship. There's kind of a before and an after in my life that are very clearly delineated.
Yeah.
Like the things that I learned, what that relationship taught me. And so, that was a huge part of why I wanted to write about it. Because it was such a surprising experience. And not even in terms of the circumstances, but literally just what I learned
Right.
about human nature and about love and all of that was so pivotal for me. So that's just my personal motivation was
Yeah.
I've got to tell this. Like it's something in me like was very much like that sort of cliche of writers.
Well,
There's a
I normally
voice
say,
inside
like,
of
when we're
you.
writing, we have a question we're trying to answer, and you use the writing to answer that question.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. So that's a huge part of it for me personally. But then also, there's honestly like, I mean, I was very intellectually intrigued and kind of remained that way by the idea of having a memoir that was rooted in pop culture and was rooted in
Right.
sort of my academic interests and then, the Hollywood studio system and all these different layers of things that interested me. I mentioned this in the book several times, but I adore Karina Longworth's You Must Remember This podcast. It's my favorite. And so I'd listen to that. I think she started that in 2014, maybe. And I would listen to that and just be like, "Ooh, this would be fun to like, weave in." And so I think just there was a part of my brain that loves puzzles was always a little bit playing with that too. Like
Mhm.
especially the further in time I get out from the immediacy of the events. And have some space. And I'll say too, like my ex-husband's always been incredibly supportive. He and I are on great terms now, good friends. I just texted him yesterday about some random thing on TV. So we're great.
Yeah.
He was at my Chicago launch event, which was amazing. So he's
Yeah, so
absolutely fully,
You and Devin met when you were still teenagers, right? At
yeah.
a Christian camp in the South in
Yeah.
Mississippi. That was in Mississippi, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And you know, you guys, it's interesting how you portray those moments, right? Because he was really reluctant to pull the trigger at certain points, and you were like, no, we need to be together. We love each other, and that's a really good moment too, because you see his reluctance, and we don't know, he doesn't
Mhm.
know, or you don't know at that time why he's gone through a version of conversion therapy, and so has things that he's not telling you and things like that. But for me, I mean, first, okay, let's lay it out. First, we don't have a lot of memoirs about women from the South. Like that's actually just
Yeah.
a fact. So I really appreciate that. And I feel like you show the New South in a way that is really honest. Like you're not saying, you're not going into those tropes, right? Especially coming from Mississippi, we have like all the Southern Gothic and everything else. Like we don't get that, right? We get the New South. Um, but also that bond that happens when pre-internet, we're the same age, like late Gen X, and you get these moments where, like theater kids, like you just like fall in love with each other and are obsessed with each other,
Yeah.
and you
Mhm.
revisit that. And so that's what you're talking about as well, why that was so pivotal, right? I mean, you finally found
Yeah.
somebody who supported you, who saw you, and when we feel seen, that's huge.
Absolutely. And I think that's the immediate. So, I've been talking about this a lot over the last few months, but I think the third night that my ex-husband and I knew each other, we stayed up until 5 o'clock in the morning talking. And the thing that sort of immediately bonded us was both of us feeling in our own, disparate ways, like outsiders, like exiles, from this community that we were very much supposed to be a part of.
Yeah.
We both grew up in these very much, Christian, evangelical, very much of the 80s, 90s purity culture, all that kind of stuff, like all these different pieces kind of weaving in, very much like James Dobson bringing up boys, that all of that sort of poisonous, messaging was very much a part of, and I'll just say too, like, circling back even to the Christian publisher thing, what interested me about the publisher was my editor was my fellow in the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop. And so she was one of the first people to reach out to me and be like, hey, let's do something with this fun. And pretty much just about every person that I've interacted with there identifies as queer. Like there's, a very like affirmative, like, setting there. And they want to do some
Mhm.
interesting things with this sort of like, broken messaging we receive. So this is
Yeah.
one of the first in their kind of more like literary memoir, like lines or whatever. But I'll let you say, like, that's, I think that was I knew that that was my trajectory, was essentially like deconstructing from so many things like over the
Yeah.
course of that relationship. But yeah, that's how we, that relationship with my ex-husband just started as, and I think too, like, there's so many elements. I think this is not just, church messaging, but it's also sort of like rom-com messaging and all of that, right? That is, if you find this person you can't imagine living your life without, you marry that person,
Right.
right? I mean, I think that's kind of part of what he and I both sort of like had this very heteronormative, patriarchal
Yeah.
sort of view of things. It's like, the only way to sort of express that deep attachment and love is to marry someone. So I think we both, even from the beginning, were like, okay, something's happening here. We don't understand what it is, but that was
But
it.
I think that you do such a fabulous job of, um, not blaming. I mean, you acknowledge the support he gave you, but also you obviously have every right to be angry and
Yeah.
to also be dealing with shame and all of these other things.
Yeah.
And we so often, as you know, get the story from the male-centered
Sure.
narrative, and and normally the woman who is mistreated in these cases or is ruined or whatever, however it is in the tropes in the literature, right? Like as I was researching, I realized like all of the fiction is cautionary tales. It's not. There's nothing ever positive about it.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
it, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's, that's the old Toni Morrison line, right? Like if you can't find the book you want to read, write it yourself, like that kind of idea. And within a couple of years of all these events, I started to try to write about it. Like so when I went into my MFA program and it starting in 2005, I was like, okay, I want to try to like excavate that relationship just to understand it and also kind of just play with form and all that from a craft perspective. And trying to find anything that was even like a little bit parallel just didn't exist. And you have these narratives like you have Far From Heaven, so you have Todd Haynes telling that
Yeah.
story, and you have Harper Pitt and Angels in America, and that's Tony Kushner
Yeah.
telling that story. I mean, I would rather have Tony Kushner tell my story than anyone, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just, they're told by men often, even when they are like woman centric
Yeah.
POVs, they're told from the perspective often of a gay writer, who's a man, and so it is an interesting, like, insight. But, like, one of the, I talk a lot in the book about sitcoms and SNL and sketch comedy generally, and that's always been a love of mine. And one of my favorite sketches of all time on SNL is The Actress, which has Emma Stone playing the beard in a gay
Yeah.
porn. And they hired real porn actors to be in the sketch, which was kind of groundbreaking at the time. And Bowen Yang wrote it, and I adore Bowen Yang. But the whole, joke of the sketch is that she keeps trying to give this character some sort of motivation or backstory. And it's like, I think her name is Deirdre. She's like, Deirdre, what are you feeling? And she has this cold sweater on and, just very like frumpy kind of, beige coated, character.
Yeah.
And then Beck Bennett, who plays the director, is like, she doesn't have a backstory. She exists to be cheated on. Like, that's her whole,
Yeah.
raison
It's a
d'etre.
trope in gay porn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And so that, anyway, it's been funny to kind of play around with some of those. My friend Chris, who's also Chris Stedman, who's a writer, and I have a frequent joke from that sketch that we do all the time, just out of the blue. We'll just text each other, Jared, Godson, because that's two of the characters that she talks about in the sketch. But yeah.
Well, and even in the second season of The English Teacher, which I'm not sure if you saw, but being
Yes.
one, I figured you might be interested. There's another one within the South, which is the effeminate man married to a woman, and we're always like, I mean, I dealt with it a lot with
Mhm.
like these guys who were like the music directors of their churches, and you're like, are they gay or they just have a lisp, and then they're married to a woman, and it's just a thing in the South as well.
Mhm.
And it persists, and we're not sure how to deal with it. And that one
Yeah.
has a twist, right? In that episode, because he's like, yeah, like it's all out in the open. Everybody knows. It's
Yeah.
just, but that's different. But so, I mean,
Yeah.
right now, one of the things that I was shocked by is that like lavender marriage is this term that used to have a negative connotation, that the youth of America are recovering it and seeing it as a positive. And some of that can be attributed to a very well-connected social media influencer couple who have been profiled in the New York
Mhm.
Times and the Washington Post. And I'm not even going to use their names because I don't want to like promote them more. But I was like, hey guys, like this was something really painful for my generation and previous generations. And yet they're making it into something where mixed orientation marriages can be consensual, they can be positive. And I think that's one thing that people might have a question. I mean, you end it obviously knowing about all of the, and I don't normally use this term, but all the infidelity that
Sure.
Devin perpetrates, and then you realize he's been cheating on you for a while. Was there a time when you were like, "Well, maybe I'll make this work even after that," or what did you think?
So I think, I mean, this is where I think some of the messaging that he and I both received in our faith communities definitely kind of comes into play, because I think my understanding of, I mean, I started to have, and I delve into this some in the book. I don't know that I really delve into it to the full extent that I felt it often at the time, but I was pretty much ready to split up with him multiple times over especially the last couple of years, because they
Well,
were
he was
so, so
gaslighting you
hard.
for years,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and you never used
absolutely.
that term. Congratulations, you never used the term, but he definitely is gaslighting you.
Thank you. But yeah, that was tough. And I think that my perception, right, even as much as I was kind of divorcing myself, but for what it's worth, people who don't know the story or haven't read the book yet, by the end of our marriage, we met this Christian summer camp, and then over the course of 7 years, sort of, elapsed from then. I was getting my PhD in queer theory. I was living in Boys Town in Chicago, which is now called North Halsted, but was at the time Boys Town. My best friends in my program were gay men who were there. And my friend Nick in particular.
Kelly, let's just say you were gayer
Yeah,
than Devin. Like you were like studying queer theory. You had all gay friends. You were living in Boys Town. I was like, you were
yeah,
gayer than he was. So
yeah. The psychology of that bears noting for sure. I mean, I think that's a long book in and of itself. Like, trying to delve into that. Like, it's a long story too. He teases me about that now. He's like, I think you have more gay friends than I do. But yeah, I think that that was, that's a whole long thing,
yeah,
but that is the context, for what was happening. And so all that to say, like, I think one of the reasons why I stayed was I think, my dad's a therapist, my mom was a psychometrist, like both of them, like their full jobs were helping people, right? And I kind of
Yeah.
came from this like long lineage of caretakers and stuff. So I think there was a part of me, a very codependent part of me that was like, he's gonna die if I leave him, like,
Yeah.
and that's what he would say, like that was very much my understanding. Like if I remove myself from this situation, as like limited and short-sighted as that was, I felt very much like kind of like stuck in that role. But I think there was also a part of me that still had this sort of Christian messaging of, when you get married, you make a covenant, and it's like this
Yep.
Old Testament thing of you cut an animal in half and walk between the sides and say, "May the same thing be done to me if I
Yeah.
break our, covenant." And the New Testament version of that teaching that I was given as a teenager in particular was you can't get divorced unless you have biblical reason. And that was very much meant to understand, you understood by that unless a person cheats on you or, there's physical abuse happening. And in some cases, even in those cases, the people in your church would be like, no, you got to stick it out and work it out
Yeah.
and figure it out, which is incredibly damaging, of course.
No, I
Um,
think it's great that you actually talk about that codependent side. I mean, Um, so to overshare for a second, like I dated two closeted Christian guys in the South. After the first one, I was like, I'll never do that again. And of course, I did it again. But they also were really good at controlling that messaging and making you feel like I'm going to kill myself if you leave me. I'm going to, there's a lot of this emotional abuse that as a Gen Xer, we didn't think of it as emotional abuse. We just thought it was like,
right.
this is a relationship. And we didn't have the
Yeah,
language. I mean, I have to say, millennials and Gen Z have really helped me with some of that, of
absolutely.
understanding. I mean, just like you say, you used to always tell this story as a joke, and yet there's a trauma there. And I feel like younger people helped me understand, like, oh, wait, there's actually things that you need to unpack rather than just make it into a joke. But that's our generation, right? We were like,
One
we'll not,
million percent.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think like, I mean, I've laughed about this a lot. Speaking of not making it into a joke, when one of our last sessions with the marriage counselor that we were seeing at the time, this isn't in the book, but um, when we were just sort of like deciding on the logistics, okay, we're splitting up, we're separating, this will be the terms, like all that kind of stuff. And the marriage counselor looked at me and was like, okay, when you get to the airport, I want you to buy a copy of Codependent No More, and I want you to read it on the plane because, honey, like you need to, you're going to need this, like you're going to need this book. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I was honestly I was very lucky in many senses at that, splitting up happened because I did have so much support. And I do think, honestly, that is one of the differences in the way that he and I experienced that split was that I went into a situation where everyone felt sorry for me. Everyone was there to kind of like support me. Everybody was like, ready to like embrace me, welcome me back, help me, find new, things to do with my life and all that. And I think he had the reverse experience of, not receiving a lot of support, feeling a lot of shame around our friends and, all of that. So I think his experience continued traumatic in a way that mine, pretty much, I was able to kind of circumvent some of that after we broke up.
well, that's very generous of you. But I I I want to read something that you wrote in the People piece that you published a
Oh,
couple months ago, if you don't mind, because I think some people could ask, okay, why is Jerry interviewing Kelly, who is a straight woman who's married and has a child for a queer
mhm.
love project? But I actually do think this is a queer love story, and
I do too.
this is what you wrote. True love stories are always messier than tropes, and the ultimate reason I wrote my book was because it is and was a love story. Once there were two sweet kids who came of age in the evangelical purity culture of the 1990s, a world in which LGBTQ plus or accepting anyone who was gay was seen as a sin that could send you straight to hell. From the moment those kids met each other, they kept talking and talking and talking. They made each other laugh. They understood each other. They had the same vision for the life they wanted to lead. They loved the same movies and TV shows and songs. They loved each other. They slept together no less, maybe even more than the average American couple, really. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I think that's, if there's sort of like some subtext or themes that were important to me to try to convey, and I think a lot of that I tried very intentionally to just stick with story and kind of let the themes emerge, organically, and to allow space for people to kind of take away from the book like what they felt was important. But I think that for me, kind of the ultimate, takeaway from that experience, just as a person, not even as a writer writing about that experience, was just the breaking of the binaries that did for me. I
Right.
think we have very rigid ideas around, a lot of things, right? Including sexuality and including, gender identity, which is something for me that's still kind of like an ongoing like process of
Mhm.
understanding who I am, in that way. But I think that is, yeah, I think, part of, and honestly, not even so much in terms of identity, but just in terms of love. Like, what equals love? Like, what is a love story? How do we, is it only a love story if it works out and two people end up together romantically? Is that only a love story? What else gets to be a love story? And I think, you mentioned earlier, like writing towards the question, and I think that was
Yeah.
one of the questions that most kind of drove me as I tried to write about that.
Well, one thing that and I'm gonna talk about it from my experience as being the GBF and also having, women who wanted to date me or tried to
Sure.
make to fix me. It was a painful experience as well. Like, I mean, in high school, I was dating, well, as I mentioned, I was dating a teacher in my school, and all my friends knew it. But one of my best girlfriends, she still wanted me to go to prom with her, and I was like, "Well, if I'm going to go to prom, I want to go with my boyfriend. I'm not allowed because it's illegal, for many reasons, which I'm writing about as well."
Yeah.
But it was like this sort of idea, and her mom actually said to me, she's like, "How can you do this to her? Or how can you break her heart and not take her to prom?" And I thought, "What is wrong with you people? Do you not respect that I'm gay? Like, you don't actually
Yeah.
believe about my," And so what I loved about what you did in this book is you always acknowledge Devin's reality and don't negate it, and you're not trying to fix him. What in fact, what I thought was really lovely, you have this one line where you say, love has to be something like sameness. This is when you were in your early 20s thinking that love has to be something like sameness, but also you think that he might just save me. And this is actually an idea that I'm very attached to, which is often when we're young, we're looking for a life raft. And when we find that life raft to get us out of our situation, that's what we
Mhm.
cling to. And both of you found your life raft, right? Like,
Yeah.
and you clung to it and you got to Chicago. Like that was your,
Yeah.
as you said, your main character energy when you got out of, Jackson and you moved to Chicago,
Yeah.
but that is part of that codependency, right? I mean, you guys did
Absolutely.
need each other, you guys did save each other,
Mhm.
and you wouldn't be the person you are now without that relationship, as you said.
1,000,000%. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, one of my friends made the analogy that the marriage is kind of like life raft that got us both to like a safer shore, even if we ended
Yeah.
up kind of like, diverting paths, once we got there. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely believe that. It's one of those conversations. It's always challenging. I think partly because of the fetishization of suffering that I experienced in church growing up, where it's like you have to suffer for your faith. You have to like really like you have to be a martyr. You have to like all this kind of stuff. Um, and so I'm always very hesitant to praise a difficult experience as if you couldn't have learned your things some other way. But I do think in this case, I can't imagine my life without that experience. Like I can't imagine my life without that relationship, that first marriage. But also, I can't imagine who I would be now had I not had that experience. How I would have kind of like stayed in the path that I had started on potentially. And I don't know who I would be without that.
Well,
So I do very much feel like that it saved me in a lot of ways.
one of the beautiful things, you never use the word feminist, but we see your feminist awakening, right? We
Yeah,
see
yeah,
you realizing when you have agency and when there's a world out there that you, and in fact, what is really, I think special about the story you tell is you have this partner who is supporting you. And in fact, I wonder if that is one reason why some women do find themselves attracted to queer men is because they need a man that is gonna support them and not try to keep them down, and you kind of get into that, right? Whereas, you know, sometimes there are obviously straight men who aren't like that. And yet we're dealing with the moment right now with the manosphere and everything, which is saying like, oh, we have these weak men and they need to go back to having trad wives and blah blah blah. So we're like seeing this reaction, but in fact, you found a man who said, "Oh, you're smarter than me. You have a goal, and I'm not going to stop you from that." And I have to say, being a
Absolutely.
person who helped somebody through grad school, that was the most difficult 8 years of our relationship and of my life, was being a partner of somebody getting a PhD. So the fact that you did get, you didn't make it through the PhD, but you did have somebody helping you through that
Yeah.
is a huge
Oh,
thing,
absolutely. I
especially
mean, yeah. I couldn't have paid my rent. I mean, there, bottom
right,
line, like if we're talking about this from a purely economic standpoint,
right,
and marriage is right, an economic, institution or whatever. Like, I mean, I think that is absolutely 1,000,000% true. But also, yeah, like emotionally and in terms of being someone stable in my like semi-stable in my life that I could kind of count on, in the midst of like all these changes. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That was the case for sure. And I mean, I think like generally, like I think so much of that relationship, like I get the appeal, like really there are so many men in my life who are, my many of my closest friends who are gay men. And there is something about that relationship that is different, even in my close relationships with women. And they're that is an interesting like dynamic for sure that I think is, definitely like deserves more, press time and more attention. But yeah, and I think like too, when I read a lot of this, sort of new lavender marriage, or see like TikToks that are sort of like poking fun at it. Like there's a great TikToker who I really like who, will come on and say like, here's why we need a lavender marriage. Like, here are the things that I will do for you. And they like list all, and I'm gonna get it. I think that I absolutely get that. And um, so yeah, and I mean, you mentioned, being drawn to like more than one closeted man. I definitely did that after my divorce too. Like there were definitely times when I would, have a close relationship that was sort of borderline, and that, I would kind of, experience some of those same senses of attachment or desire to
right.
attach, and a willingness to kind of be like, okay, maybe I don't need sex, maybe this is just something. But ultimately, sex won out.
Yeah.
So I did need that, as it turns out, and I'm very
Well, as you
happy.
mentioned, it was confusing to you because you and Devin had a lot of sex, and you're like, but if he were gay,
Absolutely.
it wouldn't work, and that's what we're told.
Yeah. I mean, that's the binary too, right? I mean, I think that's the thing that many people, I mean, and one of the kind of like stock comments I've gotten probably dozens of times, especially early out of that relationship was, well, didn't you know when you guys never had sex? And I was like, we did. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, that was a part of our relationship.
Yeah,
And then I think that, the standard response to that is sometimes, well, wasn't he bisexual? And no, he's not, like he doesn't identify that way at all. Has not dated a woman since, we split up.
yeah,
And so I think that that's just, it's complicated. I think it's ultimately kind of what my experience taught me, is that
yeah.
those relationships are complicated in ways that I think we tend to
It's complicated.
undervalue. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly, exactly.
But I do think that I'm just going to call it your feminist awakening, your epiphany.
Yeah.
And so if you could kind of explain to people when you are understanding women's way of knowing and you're talking about connected knowledge versus separate knowing, can you just unpack that a little bit for us? I mean, you're an expert at it more than I am.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. Um, well, I started grad school. We got married in July of 1999. I had just graduated from college. I started grad school immediately and had the very good fortune of ending up in a class with this guy David Miller, who's a brilliant teacher. I was just
Is
emailing
that
with
at
him
Ole
this
Ole
morning.
Miss? Where was that?
No, so this is at Mississippi College actually, which is
Oh,
weirdly like a Southern Baptist school in Clinton, Mississippi. But it's again complicated, right? Because like the sort of like things that the college says don't always line up with what the faculty believe or who they are,
right.
and all of that. And so I ended up honestly having the most progressive sort of liberatory experience of my life educationally at that institution. Um, but literally the first night of grad school, he started us off with this book, which is kind of a pretty classic like feminist text. It's called Women's Ways of Knowing, and part of the point of that book is that there are these categories of knowing, and one that we would identify as maybe classically feminine or feminine coded, or is this idea of connected knowing, like a knowing that embraces like nuance and interconnectedness and interdependence and all of these qualities that I think that historical sort of like categorical like Western study did not allow for and was very like masculine coded.
Hmm.
Um, and that was the first time in my life. I mean, I literally in my life, and my mom was like pretty feminist. I mean, it's kind of it's just we just the world that I grew up in was very different than what my parents were about too, which is kind of a complicated part of all of that. But like that was the first time in my life that anyone in authority over me in a sort of academic context or any sort of like philosophical context had said like, what if this is a whole new way of like knowing, and what if this is
Right.
good? And the fact that that person happened to be a man is a complicated piece of that story too. But he was really the person who kind of introduced me to feminism, really in many ways. And so, yeah, I mean, from that point on, I had this sort of like intellectual, but also sort of like, cognitive, spiritual, like sort of holistic awakening, where things just began to slowly kind of shift beneath me. And
And you
yeah,
do a
that
good job of
was the process.
explaining that because I could imagine that's a difficult thing to write about and not make it boring, right?
Oh my God. Yeah, what? Absolutely. Yes. That was one of the hardest. I mean, when I talk about the craft of that, I have 3 chapters with that teacher, and they're all just me sitting in a class having an epiphany. Like that's not an interesting thing, like
Right.
in and of itself. So like trying to kind of like re-enter that time and make that something that felt like it had even a little bit of dramatic tension or like just anything external to my head, that it wasn't all just abstract emotional sort of like stewing, was hard, and yeah, that was a huge crash house. One of the things that was like kind of a happy accident though of my process was that I found those notes that I had from those classes. So I've kept them, and I mean I have literally right there one of the books that I talk about from that first class. But there's a bit in the middle called deconstruction, or at least it was when I still had chapter titles, and it is the Derrida chapter, and one of the things that really helped me in that process was finding I had this yellow legal pad that I took notes on for that class, and I had like all of this stuff just like meticulously written out in there, and so I was able to like mine that for that particular chapter. Like for instance, one of the sentences he made us diagram was "I love you," and so like parsing that, I mean it was one of those things that as a person like again intellectually kind of like having this puzzle to unravel or solve, it was like, oh my God, I was actually asked in the midst of all this unfolding to diagram the sentence, I love you. Like, what? So there were just all these little nuggets that felt very delicious, from a writing perspective to play with
It
there.
it was actually really great, and I have to say I wanna thank you for that and that you brought it up because I have been struggling for years. The reason why I started Queer Love Project is partly because of the word love is such a
Mhm.
word that doesn't it fails us because it's like the one word we have in English to mean so many different
Mhm.
things. So when you do that diagramming and you talk about the defamiliarization and saying like, okay, well, yeah, we have the subject, verb, and object, but what are those things and what
Yeah.
could they mean and what are they supposed and that's basically what I'm constantly trying to interrogate, right?
Mhm.
Because what is love? Like, what is it?
Mhm.
I don't know. Like, I don't know. And funny enough, when I first started working on the memoir, I worked on pre-pandemic. It's the title of it is "What do you know about love?" And that's how I said it. And now I actually have a different emphasis, and I say, "What do you know about love?"
Yeah.
Is the way I think about it. And it really is the
Yeah. Totally.
intonation and the
Mhm.
emphasis. It changes everything, right?
Yeah.
Um, so you wrote a book about it. So what do you know?
Oh Lord. I mean, that's a great. That's a great. I've been hearing my grandmother. I was just telling my mom yesterday. Her mom passed away in 2008, and she was from South Mississippi. She grew up on a farm, was very, very South Mississippi, which is a whole thing. But she used to say all the time, she would go, "Oh Lord," like kind of under her breath. And I've been catching myself saying that more and more lately. Yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I think that is a nice thing. I think there came a point in the process, and honestly, like, I mean, you're describing, even like changing the emphasis of the title and all of that. Like, I think part of my process, towards the end, especially, was accepting this is going to be a story, and I'm not going to tell people what to take away from it. And there's going to be like definite, like my thumb's on multiple scales for sure.
Right.
Um, but one of the difficulties that I had in working with beta readers and developmental editors, I went through multiple different, gatekeepery, kind of like things. Um, was that there were people who wanted me to make this much more like didactic, like to make it much
Right.
more into like an argument against conversion therapy, which I was like, I don't feel like that's my argument to make. I definitely feel like I'm implicitly doing that from the outside, but there are certain things that I just felt very strongly like this is not on me to I'm not going to do the best job of that because it's not mine. That's not my part of the story to tell. Um, but I uh, but all that to say, yeah. So in terms of like even just coming to some sort of like conclusive like thing about love, I mean, I think honestly, like one of the love stories in the book, I feel like there are multiple love stories in the book. One of the like subtitles actually that we considered for a while was a love story, but or a loves story with like the S after loves in parentheses. Because I feel like my friend Nick, is very much an example to me in that book of love. And I feel like the version of love that I learned from, those men in my life in Boys Town and continue to learn from them is they had the ability to see all of the sides and to take care of both of us. And they had the ability to hold their frustration with my ex-husband and their, compassion for me and their compassion for him all at once. So like all of these things were true at the same time. And I think that sort of like willingness to sit with ambiguity or like complexity and nuance, like all of those things. I feel like that, and even just in terms of like the sort of chosen family idea, which I think is
Hmm.
something that the rest of the world would do well to learn from queer culture because I think a lot of times it does exist there in a beautiful way that it doesn't always
Right.
exist in other places. Partly because it has to, right, out of necessity,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I think that
So
that's yeah.
we've talked about the hard stuff, the theory. We haven't talked as much about the pop culture yet, and you do touch on Will and Grace, which it is a pivotal moment in pop culture. Obviously has problematic elements,
Sure.
but also we can thank it. I mean, Biden said that it's what got him to understand that same-sex marriage needed to happen, which he's the reason why then Obama evolved his thinking and helped make it happen. So this TV show, even though now seems like such a time capsule of a different time period, and then also got ruined when they tried to reboot it. It you were living during that time, living this life of the GBF on TV. You have this moment where we see you watch Angels in America when that premieres on HBO, and that was like a destination moment. I remember that as well. I mean, again, you were basically clicking off all of my pivotal pop culture moments in my life as well. So, so when you look back at that time, what do you think about the Will and Grace and Jack and Karen of it all?
I mean, it's such an interesting because, like, not only Will and Grace, but the first iteration of Queer Eye, which was then called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, came out like months before my separation, from my ex-husband happened. And so those are both like really pivotal, like
Yeah.
mass pop culture, not just like niche pop culture, but just like
Well, it was also the
mass
first time
appeal.
queer came into mainstream because we weren't really using that as much, and there's still many gay men who don't like the use of it. But yeah,
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
but yeah, no, that was a big deal.
That was a huge deal. And so I think, I mean, to some extent, like Thursday night, I mean, you want to talk about problematic. Thursday nights were my favorite night for most of my childhood because of the Cosby Show and A Different World and Frasier and Cheers and like all these shows that were Friends, later on, like that were just like sort of like tent poles of my, weekly life for a huge part of my life. I mean, I was a TV kid. My family moved around a ton. I was a new kid in school every year from kindergarten through seventh grade. So my constant in the midst of moving from out of state and from different cities was TV. So like
Yeah,
the Cosby Show living room was like my constant, thing. And so Will and Grace was a part of that, that night, that like pivotal night for me, where I wouldn't go anywhere on a Thursday night. I
no, I
didn't work
know
on Thursday nights often, because
people
I was
don't
like, I have
remember.
to
Yeah, we
do
would.
this.
Yeah,
You
I
have to
remember
be
even
at
as
a
a
place at a time.
even as a kid, I remember being in elementary school and us saying like I think it was like a like third grade teacher night or whatever. And we're all like, we have to get home to watch the Cosby Show. Like we have to get home to
Yeah,
watch TV.
yeah. Oh, I have a vivid memory. I think it was third or fourth grade for me too, where I knew that Meredith Baxter Birdie was going to have her baby on Family Ties, and I was like,
Yeah,
Mom, cannot be out past like this certain time because I have to see the baby born.
yeah.
It's a very special event on Family Ties. But I do think, yeah, I mean, another Bill and Yang skit that comes to mind immediately is the Oompa Loompa who got outed, is one of his like weekend updates. Yes, and he talks about how they just got Will and Grace, in the Willy Wonka factory area, and they're kind of behind the times. Um, but yeah, I mean, I do think, in terms of just sort of like, and I mean, Modern Family, right, is like not too long after that, like 5 or 6 years
Yep.
maybe after all of that kind of originated, and a similar, complicated but also important, a story, in terms of like mass appeal, and mass.
But people might forget that Will and Grace actually did have a pact that if neither of them could find love, they would get married and have a child together. And of course, what
Yeah,
happens is they both end up finding love and getting married, luckily.
right.
But they
Yeah.
basically were saying we're going to have a lavender marriage, a
Well,
consensual
and they
one.
started off like, I mean, they started off engaged, right, on that show.
Yeah,
Like that was part, and I think that was, another part of the way that I would tell my own story was, I think it's very neat for them that Will was able to name who he was early enough that they didn't pursue that path. They didn't actually end up getting married.
right.
And that's, it's helpful from a plot perspective, right, for that to be the case. And I think there were times in my life when I would have been tempted to say something like that. Well, I always knew, or like just try to kind of like make myself seem more
Yeah,
savvy or together than I actually was. And one of the pieces of memoir advice that I found really helpful, was from Mary Carr's Art of Memoir, and she has a line in it about show yourself wanting something dumb. And for me that was kind of like okay, because there is, even when you're retelling a story that is like vulnerable or personal, there's still this sort of self-protective impulse that you have to want to make yourself seem um cooler, better. Like I,
yeah,
I knew this, or I didn't really want it that bad, or I mean, even honestly, like with the faith pieces of it, like I wanted to belong, like I wanted to be a part of that camp, like I wanted to fit in. I just wanted more than anything else to sort of like be where everybody else was, and I just couldn't. Right, there was just something in me that just like resisted that, very, very, strenuously.
yeah,
um, but yeah, so I think like that I think what where Will and Grace to me, just from my limited vantage point, is a little bit limited, is that it just says, so like, yeah, we're gonna do this, and then we figured it out, and then we're gonna have this best friendship, which is very nuanced, it is very like attached and complicated. And I do think that there were some episodes in particular that I can think of that were lovely, in expressing that the sort of love story that relationship also was. But I think it does, have these little easy plot things that kind of make it a little less complicated than that relationship even sometimes is. So I don't know if I'm articulating
no,
that as
yeah,
well.
you are. I guess, and then what I want to ask next is related to the difficult thing of, you mentioned not wanting the book to be didactic, and I think you
Uh-huh.
successfully did that. But now people are going to read it and look to it for advice. I mean, what if there is a woman who's in an unhappy marriage with her closeted gay husband and has made it work for even 30 years? Like, what do you say to a woman
Mhm.
like that? Or what do you think? I mean, obviously, there's a multiplicity of ways of making
Sure.
one's life
Mhm.
successful or make it work. But are you getting that sort of question from people of like, all right, Kelly, tell us what we should do?
I fortunately haven't yet gotten a lot of that. And I'm so like, I mean, I think honestly, one of the sort of, byproducts of having grown up with this very didactic, very like binary, dualistic like way of being in the world, is that I have developed an allergy to advice giving. So I definitely have just sort of a resistance to that generally, probably honestly to a fault. Like it's hard for me to kind of be definitive sometimes and to just like say like, yeah, don't do this. Um, I would hope. I mean, I will say, the responses that I've gotten have mostly been from people who have had a relationship like that, have been in a relationship. It's mostly been past tense, versions of that. I have not gotten a lot of, feedback from people who are still in a relationship like that.
Right.
And I don't know. I'm sure there's many reasons for that, but thus far, I haven't really gotten a lot of that.
Well, I did notice on your
But
Goodreads that the women who've read your book and commented absolutely love it. But I've noticed that sometimes the men are not as big of fans, which I find interesting. And
well,
not that
to
you
be
should be
honest,
reading your
actually,
Goodreads. I don't
sure,
recommend you reading
I'm not,
anything.
yeah. But yeah, it's been interesting. Like I do have like I mean, it's weird because my experience has been kind of the reverse of that, which is that the people who have most gotten my book have been, queer men. Like that has been
Mm,
honestly probably my primary like audience. In terms of people who've interacted with it, who supported it, who've been excited about it. I mean, you can see that reflected even in people who endorsed the book.
yeah.
Um, but I think that that's, you know, I understand there's not a monolith anywhere, right? Where there's going to be some sort of like whole group of people who wholeheartedly, and because, we're, everybody's different and everybody's, it doesn't vibe with everybody. And I
No, well,
totally
why do you think? I
appreciate it.
mean, you obviously talked to
Yeah.
your husband about it. Like, why do you think gay men are connecting to the book? Because they've been the guy in the relationship with the woman.
Yeah, I think so, honestly. And I mean, I feel like part of what I think, another sort of like trope or narrative is that you have to be sort of like the perfect victim or the perfect, the blameless perpetrator. Somehow I think
Right.
those narratives do exist. I think sometimes in these stories, and I think that one of the things that I've heard from friends of mine who've had similar experiences who are gay men is that it meant something to them to have somebody say, "You don't have to do this perfectly, and you can still be worthy of love. Like you can
Hmm.
do this wrong." And you can still be worthy of love and dignity and care and um I mean that meant a lot to me because I feel like that was kind of my takeaway too, to some extent, because there's so many. I mean, and honestly, like I start off the book kind of the primary, speaking of the pop culture piece of it, but I start off the book with the relationship between Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift, and he was in a car accident. And he almost died. He had teeth stuck in the back of his throat, and she pulled the teeth out of his throat and saved his life. And my kind of framing question for the whole book is like sometimes when I'm like really feeling full of myself, I'm like, oh, what if I'm Elizabeth Taylor? And then, but more often than not, and probably more importantly, I think to myself, but what if I was the thief? Like, what if I was the thing that was choosing him? And so I tried as much as possible in the book too to like, deal with my own complicity in those systems as well as just, individually, like with him, like the ways that I was a part of those systems
Right.
that were harmful.
Well, and
You
obviously,
know,
everyone should know that you get really deep into Judy Garland and Liza Minnelli land.
yeah,
And I heard that you and your daughter were actually going to dress up as them for
we
Halloween this
did.
year. Okay.
We did. We did. She was Knight of 100 Stars, Liza Minnelli, and I was Carnegie Hall Judy. So it was it was very fun. It's a very full circle moment.
We need to see those pictures, but and Liza has a memoir coming out in the spring, so it'll
Yes.
be interesting to see if she actually goes there. I don't. I hope she does.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I mean, it's one thing when people are complicit, right? When
Mhm.
somebody must know. I mean, obviously, Barry Diller and Diane von Furstenberg they apparently have a great relationship. They both
Yeah.
say, I mean, he's a gay man who loves DVF, and that's great for him. But and he loved her when she was married to her first gay husband. So this is an interesting thing that can be successful for some people, but yeah, I think that it's really I what I love about the memoir is that you're not settling scores. You're it's not necessarily a cautionary tale, but I do think it does
Mhm.
show people a life outside. And also what you just said, that you can have a failed marriage but still have had love,
Yeah,
which some
absolutely.
people might not understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the case no matter what the, mixed orientation, not mixed, like whatever, I think that that's kind of a broader truth, I guess.
Can I
Which is
ask
a term I'm
one
always
last question?
hesitant to use.
Can I ask one last question? Is it weird?
Yeah.
I mean, all of us writers have to have supportive partners and spouses and people in our
Yeah.
lives. Is it weird for your husband to have you talking about your ex-husband constantly now?
Yeah, not really. Like I mean, it's funny. My brother was at one of I have two brothers.
And your brother's gay, we should mention.
Yeah, my middle brother Colin is the gay one.
Yeah.
Yeah, but my youngest brother
Oh,
Craig was at my event in Dallas, and somebody asked in the audience, how has your second husband, handled all this? And he did my audiobook recording. He does a lot of sound engineering, so he was my, at home, sound engineer. Um, and my brother responded, my husband's name is Ben, and he said, Ben sort of lives by a higher law. He's not subject to the petty jealousies that the rest of us are, and it is really not. And I think that's like there's multiple things that play there. Ben is like a very like compassionate, like very empathetic person. So I mean, I think his when we were finishing the audiobook and that towards the end, and you're really kind of seeing like the pain that both my ex-husband and I were going through, he was crying and just like, man, I hope he's okay now. Like there was just kind of that feeling of we had brunch with my ex-husband this summer. It was the first time the two of them had met in person. Now they've met a couple more times since with all the book promotion stuff. But he's great. He's lovely. It also helps, honestly, if I'm being like super real. He was homecoming king at his own high school and like kind of like was very like affirmed in his identity. So I think he's just got a little bit of like security in there.
so he's very
Those of us
secure in his
mortals
masculinity,
might
is what
lack.
you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's be real though. I do think that helps. The fact that it's not like my ex-husband and I are going to get back together. Like that's not like a realistic possibility.
Oh,
So
right. Yeah, yeah.
I do think that helps. Is a little bit of like a buffer there too, for sure.
Right. So, you have made it to the finish line of this. I'm not going to ask that annoying question of what's next because I know that that is the worst question for every writer. But you are doing a lot of promotion for this book. What and you said you're going to be at AWP in Baltimore in March, so
Yeah.
hopefully we'll meet then.
I would love that.
But what what is the life of this book in your view for the next few months? Like, what do you hope to achieve with it?
That's such a great question. I do have, I feel like this is a weird thing to say out loud because like, who knows what sort of like jinxing I might find myself and or like,
This is like
manifesting
some
a future I
southern
don't
shit we're
want.
dealing with right now. We both are like, yeah, don't say these things out loud because then the magic won't happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but so I mean I have been in conversations with people who do adaptations. And so one possible version of this is like taking it and like making it into a play.
Hmm.
Potentially doing like a short film or streaming like limited series kind of thing.
Very cool.
And so I have had like some conversations about that. I have friends who like do a lot of that kind of stuff, and so I've been lucky in that sense. But I've been having some conversations with some different independent film alliances and different agencies and stuff like that. So like I've just started having this conversation.
That's
But
great.
honestly, like intellectually, that's part of what's exciting to me right now. I do have a second project that I've begun, but it's very like loose at this point. But that's I think part of why I think that's interesting is like how do you take this story, which is a very like tried and true trope, and you do have Far from Heaven and you do have Will and Grace, and you do have these other sort of like you have Frankie and Grace for that matter, you have these sort of iterations of that story that exist. And how do you make it joyful, funny, tragic, like all of those things at once, but not kind of fall on the trope of like the sad gay boy who's married, like in the or the sexless woman who like any of
Yeah.
that. How do you tell the story in an interesting new way? And there's a part of me, like the puzzle part of my brain again, that's kind of like, how would you do that?
No, I
Um,
agree because I mean you get into the disordered eating and other self-esteem things and you don't want that to become like what because
right.
sometimes in a film project or something it all just gets focused on that and
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
you
speaking of
lose
nerd
the
fast and
nuance.
Bernie, like there's a Lifetime movie where she has bulimia, right? And I remember her eating an entire chocolate cake. Like I wouldn't want that, like we don't want that, we don't want the reverse of that. So yeah.
Right. Yes, we also all lived through the Karen Carpenter Tiki movie. So
Yes. And that, so the Todd Haynes, yeah, the student film
yeah, you
superstar
mentioned you
represents
watched the
that
Karen
is
Carpenter
in there.
movie that he
Yeah.
made with
I
the
had a whole
Barbie.
chapter about that at one point and it got trimmed down, but yeah.
Well, listen, you have plenty of essays you should be publishing. If you ever want to publish something with me, let me know.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
But this has been lovely, and I'm
Thank you.
excited for your success so far and hope for you to have a lot more.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for joining me at the long end of the long holiday weekend. So we did it.
Yay, we did it.
All
Thank you
right.
so much. I
I'll
appreciate it.
talk to you later.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.